Hello, and welcome to Rory's Brainworks, where we get creative and see if it works. Today, we will be going over the basics of Dungeons & Dragons, how the game is actually played. If you remember from our last video, I did a synopsis of, well, the overview of Dungeons & Dragons, the idea of how it is played. It doesn't always go that way, but that's the fun in it. I also, in the second half of that video, went through the origins, the story of Dungeons & Dragons and how it was created. Well, today, other than going over the basics of how to create a character, how to play the game, I'll be going over the second half of that origin story, D&D through the ages, as it progresses through the various editions that have been out since 1974 to now. But before we deep dive into those basics of how to play the game, we must first thank my sponsor, Tabletop Game Shop. They make these lovely little metal dice and a bunch of other great plastic dice for your gaming needs. Go over to tabletopgameshop.com and put Rory10 as a discount code for 10% off. You're welcome, little dice goblins. Now, let's open some books, let's roll some dice, let's make some math happen. So, basics of the game. What do you really need? What are the bare essentials you need to play Dungeons & Dragons? Well, your imagination is probably the most important one of all of them, followed by some pencil, paper, dice, and probably one of the books, if you're the player. If you're the Dungeon Master, you're going to need a lot more books to help supplement your ability to tell a story. Now, how do those all come together to play Dungeons & Dragons? Well, it actually starts all before playing the first session to begin with. As a player, you will create a character, which is one of the most fun things to do, trust me. Now, how good and how bad your character is determined by a bunch of factors. Attributes, skills, professions. Your attributes are going to be the ones that determine a lot of things. Your skills help fine-tune that, and proficiencies are just things you're pretty good at. Well, how do you determine those? Well, first you gotta think about what kind of character you want to create. Do you want to be some kind of ranger that's been using a bow and arrow in the wilds for as long as they've lived? Do you want to be some strong, brutish barbarian? Do you want to be a paladin or cleric of light that focuses on holy powers? Do you want to be a sorcerer, a wizard that focuses on magical spells and twisting the fabric of reality? Whatever you want to do, you can do it. The rules will help guide you in the player handbook. Once you kind of choose what you want to be class-wise, those are the classes: bards, barbarians, fighters, sorcerer, wizards, clerics, paladins. You then choose who you want to be. You know what you want to do. You know how you want to interact with the world, cause destruction or cause healing, be benevolent, be a smooth talker. But now about you. What kind of race do you want to be? Human, elf, dwarf? There's so many different options, like a lot of different options. Each one of these choices will help define your attributes, your skills, and your proficiencies. The most important of all of these are the attributes. These 6 figures will determine how well or how poor you will do something. That is strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. The best way to describe these is the tomato analogy, my favorite analogy. Strength is how many tomatoes you can carry. Dexterity is how well you can dodge a tomato. Constitution is how many rotten tomatoes you can eat before getting sick. Intelligence is knowing that tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put a tomato in a fruit salad. Charisma is being able to sell a tomato-based fruit salad, aka salsa. Now, the class you choose is going to want to kind of line up with the different attributes that there are. A sorcerer likes charisma and intelligence. A barbarian likes strength and constitution. A ranger likes dexterity and wisdom. How do you get your attributes? Well, that's an entirely different thing involving a few dice, and randomly generating some numbers. You get those numbers and then you put them where you want them to go, based off of what you want to do, like classes. If I want to play my sorcerer, then I'm going to try and put the higher numbers I randomly generated into charisma and intelligence, which means that my strength and constitution or dexterity might be lacking a little bit based off the dice rolls I had previously. The class will allow me to choose from a list of skills to be really good at. That class also provides proficiencies I am with certain weapons or armor. That's the basis of your character. The attributes and the skills will give you a number. You take that number, add a d20, And then you can figure out how good you are at something. Or, if you get unlucky, how bad you are. So, how does that all configure to play the game? So most of the things you'll do in Dungeons & Dragons are negotiated with a 20-sided die, which is why it's called a D20 system. The higher the number, the better the success. The lower the number, well, failure's also fun. So when the Dungeon Master gives you a scenario, and you're prompted to interact with that scenario, you choose what your character wants to do, based off of a multitude of things. What kind of person is your character? What's their moral alignment? What are their codes of ethics? You give them an entire backstory if you want to greater define who they are, because you're playing this character. You're stepping into a role. So I may have a sorcerer that's amazing at casting magic, but I may have it in the backstory that they really don't like other casters. They have a grudge against other wizards and sorcerers and warlocks. Make it fun. That's important. That's actually what my other video is going to be about. Creating an awesome backstory. One that's very memorable and fun. Not just for the other players and the DM, but for you. So we've entered a hypothetical. The Dungeon Master has brought about a scenario and has prompted you, as the players, get to choose what you want to do. You choose to do a task. Well, now you need to figure out how well you can accomplish that task. So you take the appropriate attribute and the appropriate skill and proficiency. That will provide a number. That's where all the math comes into play with Dungeons & Dragons. There's a lot of numbers involved. There's a lot of basic math. Attributes, skills, proficiencies will provide you a number. You then roll a 20-sided dice, which will give you another number. 16. Nice. Put those numbers together, that is your result. Now, secretly, while you were doing that, the Dungeon Master was coming up with a number in their head to determine how hard the task you're about to do is. If the number that you got beats his number, then you've completed the task. The fun thing about it is that you don't know what the number is that they picked. It's usually a very fair number based off of how easy, moderate, or difficult the task is, also associated with your character's level and what they're probably capable of. And then when you throw out your chance, you throw out that D20 and add your other skills to it, modify it to create your result, they don't tell you outright if you succeeded or failed. They're gonna paint a picture for you. And all that time you're wondering, like, as they're describing, like, oh no, did I succeed or fail? That's the fun of it. That's the fun of Dungeons & Dragons. Sometimes you know you failed, like rolling a 1 on your 20-sided die, which is known as a critical failure. It doesn't matter how good you are at something. You can have a number that is infinitesimal. If you roll a 1, likely, doesn't matter how good you are, you will fail at that task. Almost the same thing for a 20. Doesn't matter how bad you are at a task, likely, you will succeed. Not always the truth, but it happens most of the time. So you have the numbers, you have the random chance, and you have your imagination. These are the basics of Dungeons & Dragons. When you create a character, you have a lot of choice. You take that choice and you mold it into whatever you want to do. Has it always been like that? Yes. Has it changed throughout the years? Very much so, which is a clever segue into resuming the origin story of Dungeons & Dragons. We'll return back to 1974 when the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons was released. So Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, under the umbrella of TSR, started producing the core rules of Dungeons & Dragons in 1974, and that's where we left off last time. D&D was hitting tabletops far and wide, but after a while that wasn't enough for some of the hardcore tabletop enthusiasts. In 1977, TSR split D&D into two factions, Basic D&D and Advanced D&D. This separation of players, these factions, continued until about 2008, yeah, a good long while. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was an advancement of game mechanics. The basic game held a lighter, more open tone, where the advanced version brought the rules into a more defined and rigid structure for hobbyist gamers. Essentially, once you as a player decided the base set of D&D was too basic, you can then dive deep into the intensive advanced version. D&D was unified by 3 rulebooks: the player handbook, which was for players and the resources they needed, the Dungeon Master handbook, tools for the DM to run the game through, and of course, lastly, the monster manual, a compendium of terrible beasts and fantastic creatures. The advanced version of D&D also had their own versions of these core books, ensuring that D&D TSR could continue sales. Now, one could not sustain themselves on one set alone. TSR couldn't survive if the market was saturated with their rulebooks, something they came to discover in 1980. The game was being played extensively and needed to evolve along with its players that were expanding upon it themselves. So in 1981, TSR created a revised set of basic rules and added a wealth of new material. This became the second edition of D&D, and not long after its release, Advanced D&D 2 came out as well. It was successful, but not successful enough, as it turns out. TSR was starting to hemorrhage money, mostly from a few court deals, battles that they were having, but that was another video altogether. TSR made a few people mad with denying folk the ability to use the D20 system that they were using for D&D. TSR was nearly bankrupt when 1997 came around. Sure, they were releasing a lot of good content, but the battles were almost too much, and that is when Wizards of the Coast stepped in. Wizards of the Coast, most famous for the smash hit trading card game Magic the Gathering, acquired TSR in 1997 and began development for 3 years on D&D 3rd edition. The 2nd edition of D&D was growing stale and change was coming. 3rd edition combined basic and advanced D&D together to create a more modern version of the game as we know it. It was a success, to say the least. Well liked and coveted by the gaming community. However, was that enough to satiate the voracious appetite of gamers? Absolutely not. D&D 3.5, or what would be construed as an advanced version of D&D 3rd edition, came out in 2003. And when I say that this version has rules for days, know that it was intense. Even today, for me as a player of 3.5 for a long time, it can still be intimidating at times. 3.5 is great, but not something you want to start with. 3.5, as debated by a lot of D&D enthusiasts, was seen as the perfect version of D&D, the pinnacle of D&D tastiness. So when Wizards of the Coast stopped releasing content for it in preparation for the 4th edition in 2005, it created an instability. However, there was a lot of folk that wanted a new edition that was easier to learn, quicker to play, and had a better play experience involved with it. In 2008, 4th edition was released with 3 core rulebooks, and it did not do well. A lot of people see 4th edition as a stain on D&D's editions. It made people that loved version 3.5 so angry that they created their own game, which was an exact mirror of 3.5 called Pathfinder, to continue the perfect version they loved. 4th edition was very different, and having played through it, I can understand how some people had concerns, but it was still D&D, and it was still fun. However, in 2012, Wizards of the Coast announced that 5th edition was coming, and they let the playtesting be public. That way the people really got what they wanted. In the second half of 2014, coinciding with D&D's 40th anniversary, 5th edition came out, and that is what we are all playing today. With the advent of podcast, Twitch, and the acceptance of nerd culture, D&D, the king game of nerds, became a sensation. And now D&D is bigger than it ever has been. Wow, what a journey through the editions of Dungeons & Dragons. There's a lot to it, and each one of those editions have their own style, form, and function. Some of it bad, some of it amazing, but all the while it was D&D. Stay tuned for next time when we get into the dark side of Dungeons & Dragons past. Well, hey, I hope that was able to give you a brief insight into some of the basics of how to play Dungeons & Dragons. The worst part about starting a new game is thinking that you are alone and being intimidated by the process. But in D&D, like I said before, you are never alone. Speaking of alone, Marie does not seem to be here anymore. She said something about being suspicious of gelatinous cubes roaming around our house, and I really hope she's successful in finding one, because those things are terrifying. You can't see them, and then all of a sudden you're inside one that's disintegrating you, and I don't want that to happen. Though she may need backup. Yeah, she's fine. And I would be remiss if I did not bring up my other sponsors for today, the lovely people at Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rory's Brainworks, just like this YouTube channel. They are my little dice goblins, the colonizers of dreams, and without them, these D&D endeavors would be way harder to accomplish. Thank you for spending your time with me. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to this madness, and comment down below what kind of D&D things you would like me to teach you. As always, I'm Rory. This is my brain. I'm fairly certain it works. Be safe and go create some art.